When David Miller first pulled up to the house on Oakwood Drive, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Real peace. After spending almost a decade in the military, with 3 tours in places he'd rather forget, this quiet suburban street looked like paradise. The houses were neat, the lawns were green, and neighbors were actually outside waving at each other. It was exactly what he'd promised his wife Rachel they'd find when he finally came home for good. Rachel fell in love with the house the moment she saw it. It had 4 bedrooms, a big backyard for the kids, and that dream kitchen she'd been pinning pictures of for years. Their 2 kids, Tommy and Lisa, were already racing through the empty rooms, claiming which one would be theirs. David watched his family laugh and smile, and he knew this was it. This was home. They moved in on a Saturday in late spring. Neighbors came by with cookies and casseroles welcoming them to Pinewood Estates. Everyone seemed friendly enough. One couple even helped David unload boxes from the moving truck. Rachel made lemonade, and for those first few days everything felt right. David even joked that maybe all those years of sleeping in tents and eating meals out of bags were finally paying off. But then the letters started coming. The first one arrived on a Tuesday, slipped into their mailbox. It was from the Homeowners Association. David had heard about HOAs before but never really paid attention to what they did. The letter was polite enough, just reminding them about community standards and rules. Something about keeping the grass at a certain height and making sure trash cans weren't visible from the street. Fair enough, David thought. He wanted to be a good neighbor. Rachel read through the thick packet of rules that came with the letter. There were pages and pages of regulations. What color you could paint your house, how many decorations you could put in your yard, what kind of mailbox you needed, even what time you could water your lawn. It seemed like a lot. But Rachel was a teacher, used to following rules and keeping things organized. She figured they'd just stay on top of it and everything would be fine. The second letter came just 5 days later. This one wasn't as polite. It said their mailbox was the wrong color. David looked at the mailbox. It was black. The rules said mailboxes should be black, but apparently it was the wrong shade of black. Too dark or too light or something. The letter said they had 2 weeks to replace it or they'd be fined $50. David felt his jaw tighten, that old frustration from dealing with military bureaucracy bubbling up. But Rachel touched his arm and said it wasn't worth getting upset over. They'd just get a new mailbox. So that weekend, David drove to the hardware store and bought the exact model the HOA specified. He installed it himself, making sure it was perfect. Then came the letter about the garden gnome. Lisa had begged for it at a yard sale, a cute little gnome holding a tiny shovel. Rachel had let her put it in the flower bed by the front porch. Apparently the HOA had a 2-decoration limit for front yards, and when they counted the welcome mat and the potted plant by the door, the gnome made 3. Another letter. Another violation. Another potential fine. Rachel took the gnome to the backyard and Lisa cried for an hour. David held his daughter and tried to explain that sometimes grown-ups had silly rules, but inside he was getting angry. This wasn't what he'd fought for. This wasn't freedom. The letters kept coming. 1 week it was about the grass being a 1/4 inch too long. David had mowed it 3 days earlier, but apparently someone from the HOA had come by with a ruler, actually measured his grass. Another week it was about their car being parked wrong in their own driveway, not on the street, not blocking anything, just sitting in their driveway at an angle that someone didn't like. Every time a letter arrived, Rachel would sigh and try to fix whatever the problem was. She was patient, always had been. She believed that if they just followed the rules and were respectful, eventually the HOA would leave them alone. David wanted to believe that too, but something felt off. Other neighbors had weeds in their yards, decorations everywhere, and they never seemed to get letters. It felt personal. One evening, David was outside washing his truck when a man pulled up in a silver sedan. He introduced himself as Brian, the HOA president. He was in his 50s, wearing a polo shirt tucked into khaki pants with a clipboard in his hand. He walked around David's property making notes, not really talking to David, just muttering to himself and writing things down. David asked if there was a problem. Brian looked up like he'd forgotten David was even there. He said he was just doing a routine inspection, making sure everything was up to code. David mentioned all the letters they'd been getting, and asked if maybe they could just have a conversation about what needed to be fixed instead of all the formal notices. Brian smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He said the letters were procedure and that David should get used to them if he wanted to live in a quality community. Something about the way Brian said it made David's skin crawl. It was that tone, that superior attitude he'd dealt with from certain officers back in the service, the kind of people who loved having a little bit of power over others. David kept his cool, though. He'd learned a long time ago that losing your temper never helped anything. A few days later, another man showed up. His name was Tony, and he was the HOA enforcement officer. Whatever that meant. Tony was younger, maybe in his 30s, built like someone who spent a lot of time at the gym. He had that same clipboard and that same attitude. He walked right onto their property without asking, started taking pictures of their house, their yard, their kids' toys on the grass. Rachel came outside and politely asked what he was doing. Tony barely looked at her, said he was documenting violations. When Rachel asked what violations, he pointed at a small oil stain on the driveway where David's truck had been parked. Said it was a hazard and needed to be professionally cleaned. Rachel tried to explain that David could clean it himself, but Tony cut her off. Said it had to be done by a licensed company, and they'd have to show proof within 10 days. That night, Rachel cried for the first time since they'd moved in. She'd been trying so hard to make everything perfect, to follow every rule, and it never seemed to be enough. David held her and promised it would get better. But deep down, he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. The final straw came 3 weeks later. David had put up an American flag on a pole in their front yard. He'd served his country for almost 10 years, earned medals he kept in a drawer because he didn't like to brag, and he was proud to fly that flag. It was a big flag, sure, but it wasn't blocking anything or hurting anyone. 2 days after he put it up, another letter arrived. The flag was too large. It violated the aesthetic guidelines of the community. It needed to come down or be replaced with a smaller one that fit their specifications. David stood in his driveway holding that letter and felt something inside him crack. He'd watched friends die defending that flag. He'd come home with nightmares and scars, and now someone was telling him he couldn't display it properly on his own property. Rachel found him sitting on the porch steps, the letter crumpled in his fist. She'd never seen him look so defeated, not even after his worst deployments. This was supposed to be their fresh start, their safe place, and instead it was turning into a different kind of battle, one David didn't know how to fight. David did something he rarely did. He called a lawyer, not to sue anyone, just to ask questions. The lawyer told him that federal law protected his right to display the American flag, and that HOA rules couldn't override that. Armed with this information, David drafted a formal complaint to the HOA board. He kept it respectful, cited the relevant laws, and requested that they withdraw their violation notice about the flag. He thought that would be the end of it. He was wrong. The next HOA meeting was on a Thursday night. Rachel volunteered to go, thinking maybe a calm conversation could smooth things over. David offered to come with her, but she insisted she could handle it. She was good with people, good at finding compromise. She'd dealt with difficult parents at school board meetings before. How bad could an HOA meeting be? She came home 2 hours later looking exhausted. She told David that she'd tried to speak during the open comment period, but Brian had talked over her the entire time. When she mentioned the federal law protecting flag displays, he'd dismissed it, saying she didn't understand how HOAs worked. Tony had been sitting in the back row, arms crossed, smirking the whole time. A few other homeowners had tried to support her, but Brian had shut them down too, saying they were off topic. Rachel had left the meeting feeling humiliated and angry. She wasn't used to being treated like that. In her classroom, she was respected. Parents listened to her. But at that meeting, she'd been made to feel small and stupid. David could see it had really hurt her. Over the next month, things got worse. The HOA seemed to be watching their house constantly. Brian or Tony would drive by multiple times a day. Sometimes they'd slow down, take pictures, and keep driving. Other times, they'd actually pull into the driveway and walk around the property, clipboards in hand, looking for anything they could write up. One Saturday morning, David was in the garage working on his truck when Tony appeared in the driveway. Didn't knock on the door or announce himself, just started walking around taking pictures. David stepped out and asked him what he was doing. Tony said he didn't need permission to inspect properties in the community. David pointed out that this was private property and asked him to leave. Tony got in his face, chest puffed out, and said if David had a problem, he could take it up with the board. David wanted to throw him off the property right then and there, but he kept his cool. He went inside and called the non-emergency police line to ask about his rights. The officer who answered was sympathetic, but said that unless Tony was actually breaking the law or threatening them, there wasn't much they could do. HOA disputes were civil matters. The violation notices kept piling up. Their car was parked 6 inches over an invisible line in their driveway. Their trash can was visible from the street for 10 minutes past the pickup time. A toy fire truck Tommy had left on the lawn overnight was classified as debris. Each violation came with a fine. $50 here, $75 there. The fines were adding up. Rachel started keeping a detailed log of everything. Every visit from Brian or Tony, every letter, every fine. She took pictures and saved emails. She wasn't sure what she'd do with it all, but her instincts told her they'd need documentation. Other neighbors started quietly reaching out to her. An older couple 3 doors down admitted they'd been fined over $2,000 for violations they couldn't afford to fix. A single mother across the street said Tony had made her cry by threatening to put a lien on her house over unpaid fines for her kids' chalk drawings on their own sidewalk. Rachel realized they weren't alone. Brian and Tony were bullying the entire neighborhood, but everyone was too scared to fight back. HOAs had real power. They could fine you, put liens on your property, even force foreclosure if you didn't pay. Most people just paid the fines and tried to stay under the radar. David suggested they move. Just sell the house and start over somewhere without an HOA. But Rachel was tired of running. They'd moved 7 times during David's military career. The kids had finally settled into school, made friends, felt stable. And besides, why should they have to leave their home because of 2 bullies with clipboards? Things came to a head on a Wednesday afternoon. David was at his job at the Veterans Hospital where he worked as a counselor, helping other former soldiers adjust to civilian life. Rachel was home with Lisa, who had a half day at school. They were in the front yard planting flowers in the bed by the mailbox. It was a beautiful day and Lisa was happy, chattering away about her day at school. Brian's silver sedan pulled up to the curb. He got out with his clipboard, and Tony was with him in his truck right behind. Rachel's stomach dropped. She knew this wasn't going to be good. Brian walked right up to where Rachel was kneeling in the flower bed. He didn't say hello, didn't acknowledge Lisa. He just started talking about how they were planting the wrong type of flowers. The HOA had an approved plant list and petunias weren't on it. Rachel took a deep breath and calmly explained that she'd checked the list and petunias were specifically mentioned as acceptable. Brian's face turned red. He said she was reading it wrong and that he was the president, so he knew the rules better than she did. Tony laughed from behind him, which only made Rachel angrier. She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees, and asked them both to please leave her property. She'd had enough of their harassment. That's when Brian stepped closer. Too close. Close enough that Rachel could smell coffee on his breath. He told her that if she didn't like the rules, she should move. That people like her, who thought they were above the community standards, were ruining the neighborhood. Rachel felt her heart pounding. Lisa had stopped playing and was watching with wide, worried eyes. Rachel pulled out her phone. She'd learned from the previous encounters that documentation was important. If they were going to harass her, she was going to record it. As soon as Brian saw the phone, he reached out and tried to grab it. Rachel pulled back, but Tony was faster. He snatched the phone right out of her hand. Rachel demanded he give it back. Tony held it above his head, taunting her like a schoolyard bully. When Rachel reached for it, Brian shoved her, hard. Rachel stumbled backward, barely catching herself before she fell. Lisa screamed for her mom. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Rachel couldn't believe what had just happened. Brian had actually put his hands on her. She looked at Tony, hoping to see some recognition that this had gone too far, but he just stood there with that same smirk, still holding her phone. Rachel's voice shook when she spoke. She told them they needed to leave immediately or she was calling the police. Brian laughed. Actually laughed. He said she couldn't call anyone without her phone, could she? Then he leaned in and told her this was what happened to people who didn't respect authority, who thought they could challenge the HOA and get away with it. That's when Tony hit her. Rachel saw his fist coming but didn't have time to move. It connected with her mouth, splitting her lip and sending her sprawling onto the grass. The taste of blood filled her mouth immediately. Lisa was screaming, crying, running toward her mother. Rachel tried to get up, tried to get to her daughter, but her head was spinning. Brian kicked dirt at Rachel as she lay on the ground. He told her she'd brought this on herself. that maybe now she'd learn to follow the rules. Tony tossed her phone onto the grass a few feet away. The screen cracked. What they didn't know was that Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived across the street, had been watching from her window. She'd seen the whole thing, and she'd recorded it on her phone while calling 911. Rachel managed to sit up, gathering Lisa into her arms. Her daughter was hysterical, and Rachel's lip was bleeding down her chin, dripping onto her shirt. Brian and Tony were still standing there, actually taking pictures of the flower bed with their own phones. Like nothing had happened, like they hadn't just assaulted someone. Mrs. Chen came rushing across the street, yelling at them to get away. She helped Rachel to her feet and got her and Lisa into the house. Through the window they could see Brian and Tony still out there, calmly documenting their so-called violations. Mrs. Chen handed Rachel ice wrapped in a towel for her lip. Then she did something Rachel would be forever grateful for. She called David. She told him his wife had been attacked and he needed to come home right now. David was in the middle of a session with a veteran dealing with PTSD when his phone rang. He normally would never answer during a session, but something made him look. When he saw Mrs. Chen's name, he knew something was wrong. She'd never called him before. He answered, and his world tilted. Mrs. Chen's voice was shaking as she explained what had happened. That Rachel had been hit, that she was bleeding, that the men were still there. David didn't remember ending the call or telling his patient he had to go. He just remembers running to his truck and driving faster than he'd ever driven in his life. His mind was racing. Rachel was hurt. Someone had put their hands on his wife, on his property, in front of his daughter. Every instinct from his military training was screaming at him, but so was something deeper, something primal. His family had been attacked and he was 8 minutes away. Those 8 minutes felt like the longest of David's life. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He kept seeing flashes of Rachel's face in his mind, imagining her hurt, scared. His phone was connected to the truck's speakers, and he could hear Mrs. Chen trying to comfort Lisa in the background. He told Mrs. Chen to keep them inside and that he was almost there. His voice didn't sound like his own. It was cold, controlled, like he was back in uniform getting ready for a mission. When David turned onto Oakwood Drive, he could see Brian's silver sedan and Tony's truck still parked in front of his house. They were still there, still on his property. He pulled into the driveway so fast his tires squealed. He threw the truck into park and was out the door before the engine finished shutting off. The first thing he saw was Rachel through the front window. She was holding ice to her face and Lisa was clinging to her. Mrs. Chen was standing with them, her arm around Rachel's shoulders. Then David saw the blood on Rachel's shirt. His vision narrowed. Everything else faded except for those two men standing in his yard with their clipboards like they owned the place. Brian and Tony were by the flower bed, still taking pictures. They looked up when David came striding across the lawn, and for a second, something like recognition crossed Brian's face. Maybe he realized they'd made a mistake. Maybe he saw something in David's eyes that warned him what was coming. But it was too late to matter. David's voice cut through the air like a blade. He asked them one simple question. "Did you touch my wife?" Tony actually puffed his chest out. The idiot thought he could intimidate David. He started to say something about Rachel assaulting them first, about how they were just defending themselves, about community standards and respect. He took a step toward David like he was going to do something about it. He never saw David's fist coming. David had spent years training in hand-to-hand combat. He knew exactly where to hit and how hard. The punch connected with Tony's jaw with a sound like a baseball bat hitting a melon. Tony's eyes rolled back and he dropped like someone had cut his strings. He was unconscious before his body hit the grass, sprawled out between the petunias Rachel and Lisa had been planting. Brian's face went white. He started backing toward his car, holding up his hands, saying something about how this was assault, how he was calling the police, how David was going to jail. He was talking fast, panicking, stumbling over his own feet in his hurry to get away. David caught him in 3 long strides. Brian tried to throw a punch, wild and desperate, the kind of punch someone throws when they've never been in a real fight. David blocked it easily, like swatting away a fly. Then he drove his fist into Brian's stomach, right into the solar plexus. All the air exploded out of Brian's lungs and he doubled over, gasping like a fish out of water. Before Brian could recover, David's next punch caught him square in the face. David felt Brian's nose crunch under his knuckles. Brian went down hard, hitting the ground with his hands clutched to his face, blood pouring between his fingers. He was making horrible wheezing sounds, trying to breathe and crying at the same time. David stood over them both, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched. He could hear sirens in the distance. Mrs. Chen had called the police right after she called him. Part of David's brain, the trained part, told him to calm down, to step back, to wait for the police. He'd done what he needed to do. The threat was neutralized. That's what his instructors would have called it. Threat neutralized. But another part of him, the part that had just seen his wife bleeding and his daughter crying, wanted to do more, wanted to make sure these men never even thought about coming near his family again. His hands were shaking with the effort of holding himself back. Tony was still out cold on the grass. Brian was curled up in a ball, moaning, his face a mess of blood and snot and tears. His nose was definitely broken, maybe some ribs too from the way he was holding his side. David felt no satisfaction looking at them, just a cold, empty feeling. These weren't soldiers. They weren't even real threats. They were bullies who'd never expected anyone to fight back. The front door opened and Rachel came running out, Lisa right behind her. Rachel's lip was swollen, split down the middle, blood dried on her chin. But she was moving, she was okay, and that was all that mattered. She threw her arms around David and he held her tight, one eye still on the men on the ground. Lisa wrapped herself around David's leg, crying into his jeans. He picked her up with one arm, still holding Rachel with the other. Mrs. Chen stood on the porch, her phone in her hand, and she gave David a small nod. She'd recorded everything from her window. Everything Brian and Tony had done. And now everything David had done too. The police cars came screaming around the corner, lights flashing. 3 of them. Officers jumped out with their hands on their weapons, shouting for everyone to show their hands. David carefully set Lisa down and raised his hands above his head. He'd been through this kind of thing before in training exercises. He knew the drill. Don't make sudden movements. Do exactly what they say. Let them secure the scene. Rachel was trying to explain what happened, but one officer gently moved her back toward the house. Another officer was checking on Tony, who was just starting to come around, groaning and confused. A third officer was calling for an ambulance while looking at Brian, who was still bleeding pretty badly from his nose. One of the officers, a sergeant named Rodriguez based on his name tag, approached David carefully. He told David to turn around and put his hands behind his back. David did it without argument. He felt the handcuffs click around his wrists. Rodriguez asked if he had any weapons. David said no. Rodriguez asked what happened. David said he came home and found his wife assaulted and the men who did it were still on his property. Rodriguez looked at Rachel, at her split lip and the blood on her shirt. He looked at Mrs. Chen, who was already coming down off the porch waving her phone, saying she had it all on video. He looked at Lisa, still crying. Then he looked at Tony and Brian, both clearly worse for wear. An ambulance arrived. Paramedics started working on Brian first since he was bleeding more. They got his nose packed and checked his ribs. Probably fractured, they said. Tony was sitting up now, holding his jaw, slurring his words. Possible concussion, the paramedics said. They'd both need to go to the hospital. Another officer was talking to Mrs. Chen, watching the video on her phone. David could see the officer's expression change as he watched. His jaw got tight. He called Rodriguez over, and they watched it together. David couldn't see the screen, but he could imagine what they were seeing. Brian shoving Rachel. Tony hitting her. Both of them standing over her while she was on the ground. Rachel was giving her statement to a female officer. She kept touching her lip gently, wincing. The officer asked if she wanted to go to the hospital too. Rachel said no, she just wanted to go inside with her family. The officer told her she might need to have her lip looked at, maybe get stitches. Rachel said she'd go to urgent care later. More neighbors had come out onto their lawns watching everything. David could see them talking to each other, pointing. Some were recording on their phones. This was going to be all over the neighborhood by tonight. All over social media, probably. Former soldier beats up HOA officers. That's what the headlines would say. They wouldn't mention what Brian and Tony had done first. Rodriguez came back over to David. He asked if David had anything to say. David looked him in the eye and said he came home, saw his wife bleeding, and 2 men who'd assaulted her were still on his property. He defended his family. That's all he had to say. Rodriguez studied him for a long moment. Then he asked how long David had been in the service. David told him. Almost 10 years, Army, 3 deployments. Rodriguez nodded slowly. He said he was Marines, 2 tours. They looked at each other and something passed between them. An understanding. Rodriguez told David they were taking him to the station. That he wasn't under arrest yet, but they needed to sort everything out. Get everyone's statements. Review the evidence. David nodded. He'd expected as much. Rodriguez told him he was going to take the handcuffs off if David promised to cooperate. David promised. The cuffs came off and Rodriguez walked him to one of the patrol cars. Before David got in, he turned to look at his house. Rachel was standing on the porch with Lisa, Mrs. Chen, beside them. Rachel had her hand over her heart, tears running down her face. David gave her a small nod. Everything was going to be okay. He'd made sure of that. As the patrol car pulled away, David watched Brian and Tony being loaded into the ambulance. Tony was sitting up now, talking to the paramedics, probably already trying to spin his version of events. Brian was on a stretcher, still holding his nose, looking pathetic and small. Nothing like the big, tough HOA president who'd terrorized the neighborhood for years. David leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. His hands hurt. His right knuckle was split and bleeding a little. He'd need to wash it when he got to the station. But that pain was nothing compared to the image burned into his brain of Rachel on the ground. Blood on her face, their daughter screaming. He'd done what he had to do. Protected his family. If that meant consequences, he'd face them. But he'd do it again in a heartbeat if it meant keeping Rachel and Lisa safe. That's what being a husband and father. The police station was exactly what David expected. Cold fluorescent lights, hard plastic chairs, and the smell of bad coffee mixed with cleaning solution. Rodriguez led him to an interview room and told him to sit tight. Through the small window in the door, David could see officers moving around talking in low voices. He caught snippets of conversation. Something about the video. Something about the DA's office. David sat there for almost an hour before anyone came back. He used the time to calm down, to let the adrenaline drain out of his system. His hands had stopped shaking. The split on his knuckle had stopped bleeding. He thought about Rachel and Lisa at home, wondered if they were okay. Wondered if Rachel was going to urgent care to get her lip checked. Wondered what he was going to tell Tommy when he got home from school. Finally, Rodriguez came back with another detective, an older woman named Hayes. She had gray hair pulled back in a bun and eyes that looked like they'd seen everything twice. She set a folder on the table and sat down across from David. Rodriguez leaned against the wall by the door. Hayes told David they'd watched Mrs. Chen's video. All of it. They'd also taken statements from Rachel, from Lisa, from Mrs. Chen, and from several other neighbors who'd apparently come forward with their own stories about Brian and Tony. She asked David to tell her his side of what happened, start to finish. David did. He kept it factual, controlled. He told her about the months of harassment, the constant violation notices, the fines, the intimidation. He told her about coming home to find his wife bleeding, and the men who'd hurt her still on his property. He told her he'd defended his family. Period. Hayes listened without interrupting. When David finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if he'd had any intention of seriously injuring Brian or Tony. David said no. If he'd wanted to seriously hurt them, they'd be in a lot worse shape. He'd used exactly the amount of force necessary to stop the threat. Not more, not less. That was his training. Hayes nodded slowly. She told David that Tony and Brian were at the hospital. Tony had a concussion and a fractured jaw. Brian had a broken nose and 2 cracked ribs. Both were claiming that David had attacked them unprovoked, that they'd been doing a routine HOA inspection when he came home and went crazy on them. David felt his jaw tighten but said nothing. He'd expected them to lie, Hayes continued. She said the video told a different story. It clearly showed Brian shoving Rachel. It clearly showed Tony punching Rachel in the face while she was trying to retrieve her phone. It showed both men standing over her while she was on the ground with Lisa screaming. Then it showed David arriving and defending his family. Rodriguez spoke up from the wall. He said the DA was reviewing everything right now, that given the circumstances, given the video evidence, it was likely David wouldn't be charged with anything. But they needed to do this by the book. Dot every I, cross every T. Hayes told David he was free to go for now, that they might have more questions later, but for tonight he could go home to his family, She also told him that Brian and Tony were being arrested. Once they were released from the hospital, they'd be processed and charged with assault and battery, criminal trespassing, and possibly intimidation. The DA was taking it seriously. David felt something release in his chest. Relief, maybe. Or just exhaustion. He stood up, thanked them both, and headed for the door. Rodriguez followed him out and offered him a ride home. David accepted. In the car, Rodriguez told him he'd done the right thing, that a lot of cops wouldn't say that officially. But man to man, as someone who'd also served, David had done what any of them would have done. He said these HOA types, the ones who went on power trips, they needed to learn that actions had consequences, that you couldn't just push people around and expect them to take it forever. David thanked him but didn't say much else. He was tired, bone-tired, the kind of tired that came after combat, after the adrenaline wore off and reality set in. When Rodriguez dropped him off, there were still a few neighbors standing around in their yards watching. David ignored them and went straight inside. Rachel was on the couch with both kids. Tommy had come home from school and was sitting close to his mom, looking scared. Lisa was asleep against Rachel's side, exhausted from crying. Rachel stood up when she saw David, careful not to wake Lisa. Her lip looked worse now, more swollen, turning purple. David crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. She started crying, really crying, all the fear and stress of the day finally breaking through. David held her and let her cry it out. Tommy came over and hugged both of them, and they stood there in their living room just holding each other. Later that night, after the kids were in bed, David and Rachel sat at the kitchen table. Rachel had gone to urgent care while David was at the station. 3 stitches in her lip. The doctor had said she was lucky it wasn't worse. Lucky the punch hadn't knocked out any teeth or broken her jaw. Rachel laughed bitterly at the word lucky. David asked if she was okay, really okay. Rachel said she didn't know. She'd never been hit before. Never been in a physical fight. She kept replaying it in her head, wondering what she could have done differently. David told her there was nothing she could have done. That this wasn't her fault. That Brian and Tony were the ones who'd crossed the line, not her. Rachel asked what happened at the station. David told her everything. About the video, about the statements, about Brian and Tony being arrested. Rachel asked if David was going to be charged with anything. David said probably not, but they'd have to wait and see what the DA decided. They sat in silence for a while. Then Rachel said something that surprised David. She said she was glad he'd been there. That she'd been terrified in that moment, with Tony standing over her and Brian laughing, and then suddenly David was there, and she knew everything would be okay. She said she'd never seen him like that before, so focused and fierce. It had scared her a little, but it had also made her feel safe. David told her he was sorry she'd had to see that side of him. The part of him that was trained for violence, even if it was controlled violence. Rachel shook her head. She said she wasn't sorry. That these men had needed to learn they couldn't hurt people without consequences. And that she was proud of him for defending their family. Over the next few days, the story spread like wildfire. Mrs. Chen had shared her video with other neighbors and someone had posted it online. It went viral. Local news picked it up, then regional news. Then it was on national news sites. Veteran defends wife from HOA attack. The comment sections were flooded with support for David and outrage at Brian and Tony. Reporters started calling. David and Rachel ignored them. They didn't want to be a story. They just wanted their lives back. But the attention had an unexpected effect. Other residents of Pinewood Estates started coming forward with their own stories about Brian and Tony. Stories of harassment, excessive fines, threats, intimidation. One elderly couple said they'd been fined over $3,000 for violations they couldn't afford to fix. And when they couldn't pay, Brian had threatened to put a lien on their home. A single dad said Tony had made his teenage daughter cry by following her around the neighborhood and taking pictures of her when she was walking their dog, claiming the dog's leash was too long. A young couple said they'd been fined for having their garage door open while they were unloading groceries. The stories kept coming. 13 families in total came forward with formal complaints. The local news started investigating the HOA's finances, and what they found was ugly. Brian had been embezzling funds for years, charging excessive fines and pocketing the difference, using HOA money for personal expenses. Tony had been getting kickbacks from contractors Brian required residents to use for repairs. The whole operation was corrupt from top to bottom. And David's defense of Rachel had finally brought it all crashing down. The district attorney's office announced they were charging Brian and Tony with multiple crimes: assault and battery on Rachel, criminal trespassing, intimidation, and, for Brian specifically, embezzlement and fraud. The charges were serious. They were looking at real prison time. The DA's office also announced that David would not be charged with anything. They called his actions a clear case of defense of another person on private property. The DA actually held a press conference and commended David's restraint, noting that as someone with advanced combat training, he could have caused much more serious injury but had used only the force necessary to stop the immediate threat. Rachel cried when she heard. Happy tears this time. David just felt numb. He hadn't wanted any of this attention. He'd just wanted to live quietly with his family. But maybe this was how things were supposed to happen. Maybe this needed to happen so other people wouldn't be victimized by bullies with a little bit of power. The trial happened 6 months later. David and Rachel had tried to move on with their lives in the meantime, but it was impossible to forget. Rachel's lip had healed, leaving only a small scar she covered with makeup. Lisa had nightmares for weeks, waking up crying about bad men hurting her mommy. Tommy had become protective of Rachel in a way that broke David's heart. No kid should have to worry about protecting their parent. The neighborhood had changed too. An emergency HOA meeting had been called 2 weeks after the incident, and residents voted to remove Brian from his position. They also fired Tony immediately. The investigation into the HOA's finances revealed that Brian had stolen over $40,000 over 3 years. Money that was supposed to go toward neighborhood maintenance and improvements had gone into Brian's pocket. A new board was elected. People who actually cared about the community rather than power and control. The first thing they did was refund all the excessive fines Brian had charged. The elderly couple got their $3,000 back. Other families got their money back too. The new board also revised the rules, eliminating a lot of the petty restrictions that had been used to harass residents. David's flag stayed up. Nobody said a word about it. The trial itself was hard to sit through. David and Rachel had to testify, had to relive that day again. Rachel cried on the stand when she talked about Lisa seeing her get hit, about the fear in her daughter's eyes. David kept his composure, answering the prosecutor's questions clearly and directly. He explained his military background, his training, and why he'd done what he did. Tony's lawyer tried to paint David as a violent person with PTSD who'd overreacted. David's lawyer shut that down quickly with testimony from David's therapist at the VA, who explained that David had been managing his transition back to civilian life responsibly and had no history of violent behavior. The video from Mrs. Chen's phone was played in court. The jury watched Tony punch Rachel, watched her fall, watched Brian kick dirt at her. Some of the jurors looked angry. One woman was crying. Brian's lawyer tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, that Brian and Tony were just doing their jobs, that things got out of hand. But the prosecution brought up all the other victims. All 13 families testified about the harassment, the intimidation, the excessive fines. The elderly couple talked about how they'd been afraid of losing their home. The single dad talked about how his daughter had been afraid to go outside. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts for both Brian and Tony. The sentencing hearing was 2 weeks later. The judge was a stern woman in her 60s who'd clearly done her homework. She talked about the abuse of power, about how HOAs were meant to serve communities, not terrorize them. She talked about the assault on Rachel, about how it had traumatized a child who'd witnessed it. She talked about the embezzlement, the fraud, the pattern of behavior that showed neither Brian nor Tony had any remorse for their actions. Tony got 3 years in prison. His assault on Rachel, combined with his role in the intimidation scheme, had earned him the longer sentence. He'd actually thrown the punch. He'd been the muscle in their operation. The judge said he'd used his physical presence to intimidate and harm others, and that was unacceptable. Brian got 18 months. The embezzlement charges added to his sentence. He was also ordered to pay back every dollar he'd stolen, plus damages to the families he'd harmed. His face was blank as the sentence was read. He'd gone from being the powerful HOA president to a convicted felon in 6 months. After sentencing, the prosecutor came over to talk to David and Rachel. She thanked them for their courage in pressing charges and testifying. She said too often people let bullies get away with things because fighting back seemed too hard. But David and Rachel had fought back, and now 2 predators were off the streets. Rachel asked if it was really over. The prosecutor smiled and said yes, it was really over. Walking out of the courthouse, David felt lighter than he had in months. Rachel held his hand tight. They'd survived this. Their family had survived this. It had been hard and scary and traumatic, but they'd made it through together. The story didn't end there, though. In the months that followed, something unexpected happened. David and Rachel started getting calls from other people in other neighborhoods, other states, who were dealing with similar HOA problems. People who'd seen their story on the news and wanted to know what they could do, how they could fight back. Rachel, ever the teacher, started compiling resources. She created a website with information about HOA laws, residents' rights, and how to document harassment. She connected people with lawyers who specialized in HOA disputes. She became an accidental advocate for HOA reform. David started speaking at community meetings and local government sessions about the need for better oversight of HOAs. He talked about how these organizations were supposed to maintain property values and community standards, not become vehicles for bullies to terrorize their neighbors. His military background gave him credibility. People listened when he spoke. Together, they worked with state legislators to introduce new laws requiring more transparency in HOA operations, limiting the fines they could charge, and creating easier processes for residents to file complaints. Not all the bills passed, but some did. They were making a real difference. Their kids adjusted too. Lisa stopped having nightmares after a few months of therapy. Tommy relaxed his guard, went back to being a kid instead of trying to be a protector. They both understood in their own ways that their dad had done something brave, that sometimes standing up to bad people was the right thing to do even when it was hard. The neighborhood became what they'd hoped it would be from the beginning. A real community. Neighbors looked out for each other. Kids played in yards without fear of violation notices. People painted their mailboxes whatever color they wanted. The elderly couple who'd been fined $3,000 started hosting block parties. The single dad's daughter walked her dog without anyone taking pictures. Mrs. Chen, who'd recorded everything and called for help, became like a grandmother to Tommy and Lisa. She taught Lisa how to make dumplings and told Tommy stories about growing up in Taiwan. She said she'd lived through too much in her life to watch bullies hurt good people. That's why she'd kept her camera running. That's why she'd been brave enough to share what she'd seen. A year after the trial, a reporter came back to do a follow-up story. "Where are they now?" kind of thing. The reporter interviewed David and Rachel in their living room. Rachel's scar was barely visible. The house looked warm and lived in, with kids' artwork on the fridge and family photos on the walls. The reporter asked David if he regretted what he'd done. If he'd do anything differently. David thought about it for a moment. Then he said no, he wouldn't change anything. That his wife had been attacked and he'd protected her. That was what husbands do, what fathers do, what decent human beings do. You protect the people you love. But he also said he wished it had never come to that point. That Brian and Tony had been stopped before they hurt anyone. That the system had worked the way it was supposed to, with checks and balances, instead of letting 2 bullies run wild for years. The reporter asked Rachel what she wanted people to take away from their story. Rachel said she wanted people to know that you don't have to accept abuse, that you have rights even in an HOA, that bullies count on you being too scared or too tired to fight back. But when you do fight back, when you stand up for yourself, you might find you're not alone, that other people were waiting for someone to be brave first. She also said she wanted people to know that recovery is possible, that her family had been through trauma, but they'd healed, that Lisa could play in the yard again without fear, that Tommy could just be a kid, that she and David were stronger now than they'd been before, not in spite of what happened, but because of how they'd faced it together. The reporter's last question was about the flag. The American flag that had started so much of the trouble. It was still flying in their front yard. The reporter asked what it meant to David now. David looked out the window at the flag moving in the breeze. He said it meant the same thing it always had. Freedom. The freedom to live your life without fear. The freedom to stand up for what's right. The freedom to protect your family. He'd fought for that freedom overseas, and he'd fought for it in his own front yard. And he'd do it again if he had to. But more than that, he said, the flag reminded him every day that freedom isn't free. It has to be defended, sometimes on battlefields far away and sometimes right in your own neighborhood, against enemies in uniforms and enemies in polo shirts with clipboards. The principle was the same. Stand up to those who would take away your freedom, your dignity, your right to live in peace. The story ended with a photo of David, Rachel, Tommy, and Lisa standing in their front yard under that flag. They were smiling, really smiling. Not the forced smiles you see in posed photos, but genuine happiness. They'd been through hell and come out the other side. In the months and years that followed, David and Rachel continued their advocacy work. They helped dozens of families stand up to abusive HOAs. Some cases went to court. Others were settled with new elections and revised bylaws. Each victory was sweet, a small blow against the kind